Scott, we're back for another episode. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good, Frank. How you doing?
Good. So apparently more than our estimated 5 to 6 people listened to the podcast.
No, 10? Talking
Yeah.
double digits?
It was actually pretty good. I think as of now, I think maybe 2 weeks later, we're sitting at about 65. So
Oh, that's impressive. You think any return listeners?
let's hope so. Let's hope they make it past the intro here anyway. So Scott, we initially set out to talk about, inspection stuff, and we got a little ahead of ourselves, I think, just jumping straight into turnaround. I think that was a aptly named episode. This episode, we're going to reel it back a bit, and I think we'll go through some piping, registration, fabrication, and installation.
Yeah, that sounds good. All part of turnarounds, a lot of piping and turnarounds. But what else is there other than a turnaround? I guess we did get a little excited. So yeah, maybe we'll dial it back and get a little more detailed.
So I'm assuming most of you don't know Scott, but this is Scott's specialty, and he really enjoys talking about this kind of stuff. So
Love it.
let's start. Scott, what do you think we should start with? Fabrication, maybe some design and registration kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think so. If we're going to go through the whole life cycle, let's kind of start with a piping system is born, how it's built, maybe when it gets to the plant, and we'll just go through the whole life cycle of it.
Maybe one key kind of thing to note here is we are going to be talking about piping life cycle, but it's going to be from a perspective of under our local jurisdiction, which is ABSA, so Alberta Boiler Safety Association. So that's where we're going to be coming from. Some of the requirements are a bit more strict than the ASME codes. We're going to try and highlight that as much as we can if we remember as we're talking. But just keep that in mind. If you realize something seems a little bit different than the actual code, and code, we're talking ASME B31s, that's why we're going along with our local jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's right. And the B31s is typically our construction code we follow, at least for the plants that me and Frank work in. But we will be talking to the life cycle in Alberta's view, I guess, whether it's fabricated here or outside of Alberta and coming in. So we do have a bit of a hierarchy. It's ABS is kind of the top dog for us. They have the Safety Codes Act, and then all their regulations, that's kind of the top. Then we do have a CSA B51 that we have to follow. That would be the next step down. We'll touch on that a little bit. And then our ASME construction codes. Not that we don't follow them, it's just they're a little bit lower down on the hierarchy. So we meet all those standards, and then we look to see what B51 has to say, and then we see what else ABSA has to say. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So we'll get into those construction codes and our regulations and see if we can't inform or confuse everybody.
We might even confuse ourselves, eh?
I think we already have, yes.
Just one quick note. B51, CSA B51 is actually essentially, I guess, a Canadian or a federal standard to which piping and stuff needs to be fabricated to, correct?
Yeah, it's piping and pressure equipment and a number of things. We'll maybe dabble in the piping chapters, I should say, for this episode. But yeah, it talks about, and that's where the registration comes from. We're going to probably get into that right away, but that's where you'll find a lot of information on that, and that's kind of where that's all coming from, and that's where ABSA draws their information from as well. Yeah,
definitely. Let's get into it, Scott. Design and registration. Okay, CAPS, certificate, authorization, permit.
Nice.
That is issued by our local jurisdiction to piping or pressure vessel fabricators and or repair alteration companies or anyone who actually wants to work on pressure equipment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Even bolting it up too. That's all part of that. So one thing to note is a CAP isn't just a permit to go run around and build whatever you want that's pressure equipment. There's a number of line items on there as well too. So that's something to look at. If you're in the piping space, you want to have, B31.3, B31, boiler external if you're getting into that type of stuff. And then if you're fabricating vessels and boilers and those other things, you want to have those codes listed. It will be specific to if it's shop or field fabrication or both, depending on the company and what they provide. But that's little bit of the detail you want to get in with that. You don't want to just see that they're registered, they have a cap, great. You want to see what is actually listed on that cap. So don't think of it as a permit to do whatever you want. You want to actually see what's listed on there.
Yeah, the jurisdiction will define what the company can and cannot work on, depending on their capabilities, or even sometimes how well they keep records. If they're poor at managing their quality management systems, they can get stuff revoked, right?
Yeah, that's right. They'll go through an audit, typically a 3-year cycle, and if there's too many deficiencies on their audits or repeat deficiencies, they can lose that cap, and that can be for a number of reasons. And they can also add things as they go. As a company grows and they start it with piping, get into pressure equipment, different things like that, they can always add that too. So you can always see that cap start growing.
Yeah, and this will definitely kind of tie into the registration part as well. Not only does the contractor or the person performing the work or fabrication need to have that cap, it's going to be on some of the final documentation. So as inspectors, we definitely want to see what the contractors are capable of, and whether or not they're within their bounds to actually perform the work, or according to the jurisdiction, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And that's going to be, we'll get ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but our AB83 documents typically is what we certify most piping on. That's going to have their AQP number listed, and that'll be something you'll have to verify that is registered and that it's not expired and that it is valid for the scope of work you're doing. Along with that, if they're doing welding, which typically is how they're going to fabricate a piping system, you want to make sure the welding procedures are registered too. And there's also a place on your AB83 for that as well. So it's up to you as the owner inspector to verify that WP number is valid with the procedures they used and the procedures are appropriate for the material, and that they are registered with our jurisdiction. Because if they're not, they can't be used, at least in this province, for fabrication. It's a little different for fabricating outside of province or outside of country. That's not always the case. But for fab shops in Alberta, that's definitely a requirement they have to meet.
Yeah. What else do fabricators have to meet? So along with having authorization from the jurisdiction, their welders also have to be certified to a jurisdictional requirement, which is known as B pressure. We could get a little bit deeper into this, but essentially you want B pressure welders are the only ones certified. There is a C pressure ticket, which actually Scott might know a little bit more about, but it's kind of like a sub B pressure. Like, you're allowed to do the work, but you're not 100% qualified to do it, right?
Yeah, kind of. It's like an apprenticeship. I think most people listening would understand what an apprenticeship is. So basically what that is you just have to be signed up as a welder. You may have to be at a certain level, second, third year, something like that. I'm not entirely sure, but it's essentially the same thing. And ABSO will issue that to you. It cannot be renewed. So once it expires, your B pressure does not expire. That's a competency that you have forever. So you'll do welder testing throughout your career that keeps you valid. But the B pressure is a one-time thing. The C pressure does expire, and it's not something you can renew. At that point, you have to go for your B pressure, which you have to have a journeyman ticket for. So it's kind of like an apprenticeship. It's something you can get a year or two before you're done your welding trade. And if you're lucky enough to be in a fab shop or a vessel shop or something like that lets you weld on pressure equipment, it gets that practice for you. So when you go do the B pressure test, which is a practical exam, you weld the piece of pipe together. It makes it that much easier. So that's one way to think of it.
Yeah, no, that was a great explanation. So along with welder certs, they got to be definitely qualified the procedures. So that's going to be something you're going to want to check into. Maybe before fabrication, if they have a list of welders they're going to use, and definitely during fabrication, during spot audits and stuff like that. Something that gets overlooked quite a bit that Scott had mentioned while we were trying to organize the episode was also NDE techs.
Yes.
We're sitting there going through fabrication packages and stuff, signing them off. We're looking at the AB83s. Oh, everything looks good, but how many times do we double check the NDE tech certifications? And what do they have to be certified to? Now, here's our first jurisdictional versus code kind of little quarry.
Yeah, and this is an interesting topic, argument, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that's a good point. How many of you listening out there review NDE tech certs on a fabrication turnover? How many pieces of film do you look at? How many times do you check the density, Frank?
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a good topic. So this is the co-jurisdiction thing again. So ASME has their rules where NDE companies have to follow the S&T program, TC1A, I believe it is. And that's for if you're fabricating to ASME. So if you're code stamping, if you're getting pipe fabricated in the United States, for example, that's the kind of qualifications they'll have. And that's all they have to meet, and that's fine. Here, because we have B51, which outranks the ASME, they allow us to use a CGSB, which is just essentially the Canadian version, and it's a federal-wide program. I don't believe it's recognized anywhere outside of this country, but that is the governing body we use for NDT. So a lot of the bigger companies, bigger NDT companies, their guys will all be certified in both. So it's not really anything you have to worry about too much. What you'll find is most, and more so to the smaller companies, they'll just be certified through CGSB and that's it. And for the most part, that's fine, especially on site when you're in the repair realm, because we're into the B51 territory and that's fine. But it's in the new construction where you have to worry about it, where you're fabricating to ASME and you're doing ASME code stamping. That's when you have to meet the ASME requirements as well. And that's something that gets missed. It doesn't happen a lot, but that's something to look out for.
What level of certification do these NDE techs need to be according to code?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure where you're going with that. You're talking like level 1, 2, and 3? Is that what you mean by level?
Well, I'm just kind of thinking like if we're actually checking their certifications.
Okay. Yes.
What should we be watching out for? Like what would be a flag? So
well, I don't know that you'll ever see this, but if you see like a RT ticket, RT1, for example, I don't even know if that exists anymore, or MTPT level 1, if that's the only person signing off on that report, certifying that report, you have a problem. You got to be, not saying they can't do the work, as long as they're supervised by level 2, that's fine, but they can't be the ones certifying it. So if you're reviewing documents and tickets, there should be a level 2 minimum signed off on everything. And a lot of times there'll be 2 people signed off. It might be a completely uncertified guy signing off as an assistant or something to that effect. But make sure you got that level 2 there. Otherwise, it's not valid, the inspection they did.
That's right. And something that kind of gets confusing as well is CGSB level 2 versus SNT level 2, right? But since we have the CSA B51, we kind of lean towards CGSB level 2 unless it's has to be done according to code. And then there are people that are S&T level 2 certified, especially for ultrasonics and stuff like that. I think that's where it kind of comes into play a little more.
Yeah, and again, those bigger companies, the bigger NDE outfits, I won't name any of them, unless they want to pay us for some advertising or something. But everyone listening knows who they are, and they all have, the dual certified people for the most part. So that when you're dealing with them, it's not something to worry about. And again, it's more of a new construction thing where you got to watch you don't trip up on that too much.
Yeah, Scott, we have hydro testing and some tubing stuff listed next, but I think one thing we should touch on and get out of the way is fabrication done outside of Alberta or even outside of Canada for that matter. What, a lot of stuff does get built in Asia and shipped over. I know during the, early 2010-ish to 2016 kind of time period, there was mods coming from Korea shipped over on barges, and they'd chop them up and freaking ship them on trucks up to Fort McMurray and re-weld them back together, right? Like, it's insane.
Yeah, cut them down to size so they can go down the highway and then put them back together.
So we've talked a lot about AB83s, and that's kind of the form to certify your piping fabrication, your piping repair, and we kind of keep that as a record for the jurisdiction in case they ever need to look at it, I guess, essentially.
Auditing purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a more eloquent way to say it, auditing purposes, yeah. Stuff coming out of the country, though, you know, they still have to meet the provincial requirements and build to the jurisdictional requirements, right? They have to meet what the provincial requirements are to ship something here. And when it gets here, it does need to be inspected, and it also has to be accompanied by another type of AB83. It's the AB83F.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a little tricky. It kind of depends on what part of the world it comes from. They have little variances, depending on who you're dealing with. A lot of countries or manufacturers from out of country, aren't familiar with these AB forms, and it's not easy to get them to do it. And they don't necessarily have to. That is one example. That's a good example of, within Canada from out of province. That's quite typically what they'll do. You can certify these things on ASME reports too. I recall a project we did quite a few years ago. It was in a piping fabrication stage, and we had a company from BC do a bunch of boiler external piping, and they certified them all on the ASME forms, the P4As. So that's just essentially a partial piping data report for boiler external piping. It's quite a specific thing, and it gets code stamped similar to a boiler would, and then that gets sent along, and that's the data report you use. So it's a good point to note that these partial data forms, whatever they are, ASME, AB83 partials, AB83F, whatever you happen to get, they do have to get married up with a final data report at some point, whether that's in the fabrication stage or the installation, depending on what type of installation you have. So that's just something to note. If you're doing a final data report, say you've finished your final construction at a shop and hydro tested and it's all done, and you want to call it a final, and you had a bunch of stuff shipped in from somewhere else, or you're doing it on site, whatever case, you have to make sure that partial data report goes with that final data report. And there is a section on page 2 to actually fill in that information. So you have to make sure those all go together. They're not separate documents. When it's a partial, it has to find its way to a final.
And maybe one thing to note, which might seem obvious, partial AB83s though, when they get signed by the contractor, they should be signing the box on the left-hand side of the page. There's three boxes at the bottom, I think, of page 2, right?
I think there's 4.
There's one for ABSA, right?
One's kind of a long, stretched out box, I guess. We should really have a form in front of us instead of making this up.
Actually, maybe just a quick ABSA plug here. If they're not paying us or anything, but if you do want to see any of these regulations or forms, it's absa.ca for their website. It's pretty easy to navigate. You go under forms. It might be under the 500 series. There's registration forms. The 500 series is all the inspection kind of stuff. So they're actually pretty decent to read, and they're not that long.
Yeah, lots of information there for sure.
Yeah, but you did touch on something I want to take. Stuff done in the States that is inspected to the ASME instead of our jurisdictional. ABSA will accept that, but
right,
the inspector performing that does have to be certified and I guess commissioned by national board, right?
Yeah, the national board's there. I guess if you want to call it equivalent, it's we have the provincial regulation, which is ABSA, so they act on behalf of the national board if you want to look at it that way. And the national board is a bit of a countrywide jurisdiction, I guess they use in the States, and they use insurance companies and various other methods as well. But that is their code speaks to authorized inspector. So ASME code is interested in authorized inspector. So that's defined a number of different ways. In the United States, they use the national board, so that's their authorized inspector. That's the authorized inspection company. Here, ABSA is our authorized inspector. So anytime code is telling you your authorized inspector has to make a decision or has to be involved, that's who we go to.
Yeah, no, thanks. Okay. We've touched on that. Make sure the right areas of the AB83 are signed off. If you get partial AB 83s from multiple fabricators, and that could be done from 2 different contractors fabricating modules or spool pieces or even components of a vessel, and they all get shipped to a prime contractor who actually completes the fabrication. So you may get, well, you wouldn't be getting AB83s for pressure vessels, but say it was a piping system. You'd get two partial AB83s, and then the contractor installing the system and doing the final bolt up or closure welds or final welds. After the hydro is complete, they're going to give you a complete final AB83 to let you, well, to turn over the system essentially.
Yeah, this is a good point that you bring up too. I know I'm going to get a few people excited about this one, but is there only one final AB83? Can you have more than one?
Oh, fuck.
If you if all your fabrication is done in a shop and the hydro testing's done and the installation's by bolt up, can that be called a final?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like,
and then you do another final in the field?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Exactly. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Final does not have to, in some cases it does, but it does not have to mean that it's installed and you're ready to turn the steam on and go. That's not what that means. Some cases it does, but that's not always what that means. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it's an advantage to have it as a final when the fabrication's done, if it can be. Now keep in mind the hydro testing, all the code requirements have to be done. So if it's not hydro tested, you can't call it a final at that point. But sometimes it's in your advantage because then it's all buttoned up and sealed off. Everything's done, certified. And then when you install it, your installation contractor gives you a final AB83 and they don't have to go looking for all these partials that go along with it. It's just a standalone document at that point. So, sometimes it makes it easier. Sometimes it doesn't make any difference, but there's no real one way to do it. There's, like everything, a couple of different ways to do it. One's not better than the other, but just be aware of that. There's a couple ways to navigate those.
Yeah, no, definitely.
When we were talking about the out of country thing, I just want to go back to the WPS registration again. What would you do if you've seen a turnover package from, somewhere in Houston, Texas with all their ASME welding procedures in there and it did not have a stamp from ABSA with a registration number? Would you accept that?
It depends how quickly I was signing that package off, right? No, that...
Of course you would, right? They don't have to register their procedures just to build something for this province. That would just be getting out of control. That's not something that I think they could manage or people would cooperate with. So, they follow ASME, that's what they have, and then they have their authorized inspector. So it's not something you need to dig into too much. If you're getting a turnover package from out of country, you don't have to be looking for all these ABSA certified documents because you won't see them.
I think the most important thing to be checking would be to see if the WPS was created or I guess to Section 9, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's no different to here. When you submit a WPS to ABSA, that's what they're reviewing it for is Section 9, right? They don't know what all the avenues you're going to use it for. They don't know what you're going to be building it for. So that's what they make sure that it complies with. And then it's up to not only the repair contract, but also the owner inspector to make sure that WPS meets the requirements of whatever you're building, because B31.3 has a lot tighter requirements on welding procedures, mainly around thickness limitations and CVNs like Sharpies, low impact properties that Section 9 doesn't really get into or has a wider range, I would say. So those are some things to look into, but that's kind of out of the jurisdiction's hands. They can't be worried about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Tubing as well, like our jurisdiction does tie tubing in. We have that on there. How do you want to expand on that?
Somebody wrote it on the whiteboard. I don't know why.
You know what? We forgot to kind of check into, and this is going to be off the top of our head. So give us a little leeway here. I don't think tubing's covered in the ASME codes, or there is a specific standard for this.
It's something our jurisdiction clings to a little bit, and I think all we want to say about that is don't forget about it. And it depends on the application. Like if you're running tubing that's going to see some high, significant pressure, medium pressure steam or something like that, there's no reason not to treat it like pressure piping. So, I mean, it does need to be hydro tested. I don't think we got into hydro testing too much yet. This is kind of the segue here.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to touch on with hydro testing that can cause us grief, maybe not right away, but later on in the life of the piping system. And it's, it's both parties' fault. It just depends how the jobs are set up and how the information gets passed back and forth. But there's sometimes a big difference between a code minimum hydro test and a maximum flange rating. And where that can cause problems is not so much for the new fabrication, because you're hydro testing to your code minimum, so you're certifying it properly, so that's fine. Where you'll run into trouble with this occasionally is, say you upgrade your pumps or something like that, or whatever equipment you have down line, and now you got to run the line at higher pressure or temperature or both, and your system was hydro tested at the code minimum. Now all of a sudden, to increase your design, you have to rehydro test it, probably to that max flange rating or something close to that, where if that would have been done, you may have been able to avoid this. Not always. Sometimes you're going to have to do it anyways, but it's just something that we run into, and now the re-rate becomes a lot more difficult.
Yeah, and actually the AI has to come out and check that out, right?
Yeah, and depending on your relationship with them, they definitely have to receive it and survey it and approve it. So there's definitely that kind of hoop to jump through. And then, yeah, they're most likely going to want to be involved in it too.
AI is authorized inspector, which is essentially the jurisdictional inspector from APSA. So they're known as safety codes officers. They come out, they certify repairs depending on what the company's cap can allow them to do. So after you register your quality management system, you get your cap, and that allows you to, allows facilities to do their own repairs and stuff without always having to call the jurisdiction. The exception to this would be B31 piping and boilers. The AI has to come out and witness a lot of that kind of stuff. There is some stuff you can get in your cap for that, but that might be a different conversation because it goes deep.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say that's a great general statement to say. And that is essentially what the AB documents will say too, is that you can't touch that stuff. But it depends what you have in your owner user program and the relationship you have. So as you do repairs like that more frequently, you can get them added to your owner user manual. So there's a lot of places, a lot of different sites I've worked at on the owner user side that we can repair, fabricate, and certify boiler external piping, which typically the AB document says you cannot do that. That's got to be certified by the authorized inspector. But once you have that in your owner user program and approved by APSA, you can do that stuff and certify it yourself, provided you have the right qualifications and whatever else is listed. But yeah, that's a great general statement to make.
Keeping it safe, right?
That's right.
So, is there anything to touch on maybe hydro testing? Actually, one good thing to mention is our jurisdiction actually wants us to hydro test everything, even category D piping, whereas ASME allows you to waive the hydro, or there is some certain circumstances where you can waive hydro tests on category D piping, right? Where our jurisdiction says, you shall hydro.
Yeah, that's one of those we outrank you type of conversations again, where, we meet the code minimum, but then our jurisdiction says, well, we don't really like that minimum. We're going to up it a little bit. And yeah, that's one of them. We do have an exemption order where, depending on your piping size and its design pressure, that you don't have to hydro test it, but you got to make sure you meet those requirements first. It's not just an ASME requirement. So just the point to get across there is remember your hierarchy. ASME is the bottom, so you got to meet that. But don't forget to follow it up to the top and make sure you're not missing something else there. Essentially, all pressure piping has to be tested, and that's the way they say it. So, I mean, if you have some category D and it has a valve in line, and it can be isolated and it can see, over 15 pounds, would you hydro test that stuff upstream? You kind of have to, right? So it's just something to be aware of.
Thou shall, right? Thou shall.
So it's not as easy as category D per se. Sometimes it is, but not always. It's just something to be cautious of.
Well, those stuff that we kind of could get away with re-rating, though, they're usually fairly benign systems, right? Like it's not going to be like something that's transporting LVGO or something like that. It's going to be like an air system or something. Have you seen anything like that be re-rated?
No, it's really, in my experience, it's a lot of times when the pumps get upgraded. So it's, it's steam, water, maybe some sort of process, but a lot of time it's like steam and water and things like that, airlines, that type of stuff.
Yeah. Maybe another kind of some perspective we should put on is maybe someone's thinking like, why the hell would you have steam going through tubing? Some facilities here, it actually gets fairly cold. So, minus 50 degrees centigrade is not uncommon. And temperatures are averaging between minus 10 centigrade to minus 25 throughout our winter. We use steam as tracing, which helps keep the process lines at a minimum temperature, right? So they don't freeze up and stuff like that. Nowadays, though, unless it's actually really critical, like in sulfur recovery units and stuff like that, they'll use electric tracing, which surprisingly gets hot. Some of it,
it
you
does.
Know what I mean, right?
Or the contra trace when you get real crazy, and that's even more steam.
Yeah, I think we had maybe a handful of American listeners to this, so I don't know if you guys use. I'm sure for some process conditions you might keep tracing on there
the sulfur and things like that. Yeah,
but here almost everything is insulated and traced to not freeze during the winter months. There is programs to manage the tracing, but typically, it is on the newer facilities, electrical tracing, but steam tracing, stuff like that, and even for instrumentation, right? Valves, they'll use steam and air pneumatic tubing.
Yeah, for operating valves. Yeah, and it's just the geography differences, right? We're not really aware of external saltwater corrosion because we're not anywhere near the ocean, and we couldn't even imagine what that would be. Where you're probably thinking the same thing about steam tracing. Like, what would you need that for? You just look on a map, the difference between Houston and where we are, just for example, right?
Yeah.
Warm climate close to the ocean. We're sub-zero 10 months of the year, nowhere near any ocean. So just some differences there.
Yeah, it is fairly arid here, but we still do get CUI. I've been to a few facilities on the west coast of Canada, and the CUI there is like insane. Like the freaking structures, you can see the corrosion on them. The platforms, they're old facilities, so they have the old checkerboard kind of flooring. There's no grading, right? So that water just sits there and corrodes, and you're kind of freaked out walking on these platforms because you can feel it buckle.
Yeah, a whole different world. And that's something where we are in Alberta, we'll never see that. It's just totally different.
Yeah. So, just to kind of recap, what kind of role do we play in this fabrication and kind of stuff? So, you definitely want to check that the fabricator, the repair contractor, anybody coming on site working on pressure equipment, piping, pressure vessels, exchangers, you name it, anything that holds pressure over 15 psi, you want to check their cap. You want to make sure they got a QMS in place, and you want to make sure that they're certified to do what they're going to do. You want to make sure that the welder certs are valid. They're certified to weld. They're welding with weld procedures that are approved by the jurisdiction. Pipe's been hydro tested, right?
Yeah, hydro tested, very important. Check your flange rating versus your code minimum, what kind of trouble you can get in there, or if there's no difference. Just things to look at. One thing to note on the welder certification thing, we talked about the B pressure ticket. That's kind of a bare minimum thing we have here. Don't forget they also have to have their WPQRs for whatever material and consumable they're going to use too. So the B pressure is just a bare minimum. So if you're looking in your turnover, you should make sure they have one of those. Okay, step one. And then you should also make sure they have a valid, WPQR for whatever they're welding, whatever process, whatever P number. So that's getting to materials, and then whatever consumable they use. And there's a various ranges there that you can look up in Section 9 to make sure they're qualified for what they're actually welding on. So it's kind of a two-part story there. And the welders do get a registration number similar to WPS. So you want to make sure that is also on their WPQR tickets or forms that they have. There's the ASME uses a 484, and ABS's version I think is the AB76. Very similar forms, but those are something you can see in the turnover along with the wallet cards, or both, just depending on the company.
That's why this guy's on the podcast. He's an encyclopedia. Also, we want to make sure, we want to verify, it's our job actually to verify that the AB83s, AB83Fs, or any other documentation, MTRs, they all meet the spec, right? The spec of the owner user, if you're a contractor, if you're a owner user employee, if you're a unit inspector or something like that, you want to make sure that everything meets your company requirements and your company standards, because they're way stricter than the codes most of the time. And in Alberta, a lot of the times they're going to be more strict than the jurisdictional requirements, right? Especially when it comes to like post-weld heat treatment and stuff like that, especially for services, right? Like not only for code requirements, but also for service requirements, high H2S kind of environments, right? You want to make sure. Moving on, I think, B51 versus ASME we have written down. Scott.
Let me jump in real quick with the AB83s again. Just make sure you know what you're certifying, because that's what you're doing when you sign that. There's a paragraph at the very bottom of page 2, right where you're signing. You write your name at the top of it and you sign below it. It's not real lengthy. It doesn't take long to read. I'm not going to tell you what's in it. Have a read of that if you haven't already. If you've signed those documents and you haven't read that paragraph, you should be a little nervous. It's nothing to be scared of. Just read that and make sure you know what you're signing, what you're certifying. If you don't feel it meets what the intent of that form is, maybe don't sign it, or maybe ask some questions.
Every time I talk to Scott about signing documents, I get scared. So definitely go check it out, give it a read, and understand. If not, I think ABS is pretty good. Send them an email, ask them what they mean, try and get some clarification, or ask somebody who you think knows. And you know what I mean? There's got to be somebody, a senior inspector, a mentor, or, especially if you're a contractor, you're bouncing around site to site. And if you see someone who knows a little bit more than you, even the owner guys, like, I'm not going to say that everybody knows everything. Like, this stuff is actually fairly complex and confusing. That's why we're trying to clarify it and, kind of go in depth as much as we can. If we ever get to the point where we can have someone from ABSA onto the podcast, I think that would be really great. I think they may revoke my in-service inspector certification after that, but I definitely want to ask them some questions. And they're actually pretty good. There is a pressure vessel conference every year held in Banff, Alberta called IPEA. I'm sure it actually travels around, so you may have heard of it as well. But our local jurisdiction does do a Q&A there every year, and it's good for big companies to ask questions, little guys to ask questions, and kind of get out there. It's just, do you have the balls to get up in front of 100, 300 people and ask a question which you feel dumb asking, right? That's why I call Scott or text him, right? And I tell him delete that thread after. I don't want any dirt on me.
Yeah, they say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but got a few interesting ones from Frank over the years.
Okay, so we've got our piping fabricated. Our next step is going to be piping registration. This might be done in tandem because obviously, as they're fabricating, they're going to be sending stuff to the jurisdiction. There's design requirements that they might have to go through, but also without having that registration, they can't actually use the fabricated piping. That needs to be registered with the jurisdiction before we can use it, right?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it too. They can't use it. I mean, they can fabricate it all day long. That's fine. And if somebody's going to pay them for it, great. But you can't use it, which becomes a problem. More so for the owner, not so much for the fabricator. Assuming they get paid for it, it's not really a big concern of theirs. But that's one of those items that they got to fill in on their AB83. They're gonna be looking for a PP number, and that's just how piping is designated in this province. That's just how it's registered. So they're gonna be looking for that number. One thing to note on that, it's not always a new registration. Doesn't always have to be a new design, and probably more often than not, it isn't. But when it's a brand new system, it will have to be submitted for design. Similar to building a vessel. Much the same. It gets surveyed and accepted, and most of the time lumped in with an existing design registration number that's already in place, unless it's a new facility or something like that. And then on the other side of that is, if it's a lot of time you're upgrading a little portion of your piping system, or you're replacing some repaired areas, something like that, that's where you would just reuse the existing PP registration number, and that would just get filled out in your form. And that's another thing that we have to verify is correct too. Most facilities, all the piping in the whole plant is registered under one number, and that's kind of the easiest way to do it. Some facilities have it broken up, into different plants, different numbers, things like that. So you just got to be aware of that. Make sure you're putting the right numbers on there. That's another one of those things auditors love to find.
Definitely. It definitely is. Also, there are some exemptions to registration. One thing that we kind of forgot to write down, though, is there is some volume or size exemptions. Typically, if it's under 500 liters or 0.5 of a cube, right?
Yeah, 0.5 cubes. That's what I'm familiar with.
0.5
half a cube.
Half a cube, 500 liters. So a cube is essentially 1,000 liters.
I didn't check the math, but I think those two are compatible.
Yeah. It's 1,000 liters. I don't know how many gallons that is, but I'm sure there's an app for that.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody can leave us a nasty comment about that.
But typically, if your aggregate volume of your piping system is under 500 liters, it doesn't need to be registered. One thing that actually came to my mind, though, was, does it matter what product is in there?
Well, that's where the exemption order comes in again.
Yeah.
So that's something we could talk about all day as well too. But and I don't think we need to get into it, but that's a reference where you would need to look as well, where there's some piping that is completely exempt. A lot of your utility air stations and things like that don't really fall into that. So that's just something you have to be aware of too. If you're not sure, don't just disregard it. Maybe look into it and find out who your local safety codes officer is and have a conversation with them. Is, probably the first step if you're not sure.
Yeah, and that is 500 liters might sound kind of like a lot, but maybe to kind of put it in perspective, that's 25. It's essentially 500 big gulps, right? Maybe
that's a good way of putting it.
500 big gulps. You know what I mean? I was going to try and equate it to 2-liter milks, but I don't even imagine they would have 2-liter milk cans in the States, right?
Yeah, that's weird. I don't know.
Assuming all 5 of those people try and tune in again.
Yeah.
They're going to be like, who the hell are
I think we
guys?
just lost them.
So,
but it's not a lot, I think, is the point you're getting to. And it depends on the facility, right? Maybe some small public occupancy thing is, relatively small and they don't fall into that. But any of the facilities, at least that me and Frank work at, we're talking big upgraders, refineries, those type of things. It doesn't take long before you hit that threshold and, you're into the registration territory. So don't even worry about it.
No, depending on the size of piping, it could be like a freaking 2 or 3 meters long.
Exactly.
I would just put 2 flanges on it. Don't need to register. It's done. So along with this piping stuff comes a little bit of, this thing branches like crazy. And so along with your registration comes the registration of fittings. And this kind of ties back into B51, where fittings like flanges, elbows, all that kind of stuff, the designs have to be registered with the CSA, which is the Canadian, is it Standards Association? Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds right.
Yeah, standards or safety. Standards sounds more
safety
likely.
Doesn't make much sense. I would say standards.
Yeah. So these designs have to be registered, and they get something called a CRN, a Canadian registration number, and then each province has a designation number. Now, the first X number of digits typically will denounce kind of just the registration number. There will be a letter to kind of categorize which type of fitting this is. And then there's going to be a decimal, like a point, and then there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each one of those after the point is going to signify which province that design is registered in. Now, you want to make sure that the fittings coming into your province, or the fittings on your, or at least the design of it, there's a CRN stamped on it that has your province designation into it, on it. That means it's legal for use, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was pretty good, Frank. Well done. I'm glad you you got into the decimal point. We didn't talk about that one, and that's a bit of an important factor, especially for Alberta. Some of the other provinces will accept the 0.2. So Alberta's 0.2. You'll see that if it's registered in Alberta.
Yeah.
Some of the other provinces will accept that on par, and they don't need their, I think Ontario's 0.5, for example. They'll take that, or Saskatchewan's the 0.3. So they'll see the 0.2 and they'll take that. That's written into their regulation. So that's something you want to be aware of. The first letter will signify what it is. So you either got a flange, fittings are all kind of lumped together, valves. You got some category H, which is like everything that doesn't fit into something else. I should be careful. Category H is not everything. It's kind of everything that doesn't really belong somewhere else. And then that one's a bit of an interesting topic / argument as well. I've run into a couple times we're building some sort of injection quill. Typically, they're a bolt-in type of thing. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's essentially like a flange, maybe a piece of pipe, has like a probe going into it, and then it'll bolt onto a piping system that'll inject, steam or some sort of product in there to disrupt the flow or whatever its purpose is. And a big conversation that comes up with that is these need to be registered as category H fittings. Well, no, they don't, because they're actually registered as part of the piping system. Can they be registered as category H? Sure, they could be, but they don't have to be. So that's one that, I've came across a couple times on different sites, and I've kind of, gave my side, my opinion, and that was usually the end result was, oh, okay, that seems right. We'll go with the piping registration.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a regulator about it a couple times, and that's kind of their take on it too, is, it can be both ways, but that's one of those things that you're building it as a replacement usually, or a new piece, and it just gets registered along with that piping system that it attaches to. So that's kind of how that fits in. That's one of those oddball things I've ran into before, that it's kind of like, well, what do we do with this? Is it a fitting? Because it's actually a bunch of fittings. And, when you're building a piping spool, you're registering the whole spool. So now do you have to worry about those fittings? Well, the fabricator does, because they have to make sure that, that stuff's all registered, and then it gets registered as a piping system then. So it's kind of like a 2-part process, if you will.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I led into that, is like you touched on, like there's a lot of stuff that might be within the piping circuit, I guess, if you can kind of understand what I'm saying, where it might be like an inline knockout pot or an inline filter that's small diameter, and for whatever reason, instead of registering it as a mini pressure vessel or giving it its own pressure vessel A number, which is another fork. So A number kind of denotes any piece of pressure equipment in Alberta that's being used has to have an A number. It's just an Alberta registration number that the jurisdiction uses to track and collect fees on pressure vessels that are registered and in use throughout the province. So that is something we can definitely get into once we do our kind of organize our ABSA episodes. But
yeah, and I think maybe we'll go into pressure vessels on its own kind of episode as well. That's something we can talk about for an hour, I think, pretty easily as well.
Yeah, I think that would be good. So we will come across this kind of stuff, and in plants, it typically falls on kind of like a gray zone kind of area within their quality management program, where, I've even seen 2 of the same kind of little inline filters or knockout pots, or this is actually really common, is suction and discharge dampeners on the inlet and outlet of compressors. They're essentially an enclosed little bottle with a diaphragm in it. It's pressurized. It's stamped category H, right? Sometimes you see them with A numbers. Sometimes you don't. You have to be cognizant of this kind of stuff, and you have to look at it from an inspection point of view. Okay, this has an A number. We need to treat it as a piece of pressure equipment. This is stamped as a fitting, category H. We still might want to treat it as a pressure vessel, but
I was worried about where you're going with that one.
It's technically a fitting, and it's piping. So it's going to be up to the company or even the individual inspector if you get that much leeway. I don't really want to get too deep into it, but just check what you're actually looking at and what's in your piping systems, and make sure it's registered properly. And that's going to come back to the exemption order where there's sizes, capacities, and stuff like that. And we'll touch on that afterwards. We got to remember all this stuff we keep saying we'll touch on, like even from episode 1, which is a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, how much crap in there did we talk about, say we're going to touch on that we're going to blow over?
Yeah, who's taking notes? I'm not.
Not me. We need a stenographer or something, right? So we kind of touched on that. Now, we do have the cap of the contractor and the owner user written under our registration section here. Scott, do you remember why we did that?
Yeah, and I think we kind of beat it to death a little bit. I think where we were going with this is we're leading into the installation stage of our piping life cycle. And one thing to not forget is back to the old argument of the final AB83, partial AB83 from the fab shop, whatever they've provided you. But let's say they gave you a final AB83. Does that mean that anybody on site, the guy pushing the broom, the guy driving the forklift around, can they take that piping and bolt it up? Frank?
Well, I guess theoretically, if they can turn a wrench, yes, but no, they need to work for a company that's certified to do that. They need to have the proper certifications to do that, and they need to be, this is a dangerous word. Do you know what I'm going to say?
I think so.
It's a C word.
Oh, don't even say it.
Competent. So.
Yeah, well said. That's exactly right. It's no different than the welding fabrication, all the hoops they have to jump through. It's the same thing, other than, there's probably no welding procedures or welders to chase after, but they do have to have that same cap in place, and they do have to have that 31.3 piping or whatever it is you're installing listed on their cap. It's no different just because it's a bolt up and not welding. They're still mechanically assembling it. They have to be certified.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And there's also no reason the owner user can't have that as well. A lot of sites, some do, some don't, but a lot of sites have a cap that they can, fabricate, install, piping, even pressure vessels, a number of different things. And some sites don't have that at all, where they're just the owner user and they 100% rely on a repair contractor to do that stuff. So those are things to look at too. If you see your owner user company tradesman out there, installing some piping, that doesn't mean that they're certified to do it. So just be aware of that. Who's going to fill out the document? Who's going to certify it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I don't even know if I want to say this, but that kind of actually falls for or applies to the inspection portion of it too. This is going to be something I'm going to quick just dip in and out, but like along with the fabrication requirements and what owner users or fabricators, repair companies can and cannot do, the jurisdiction also kind of dictates when certain intervals of inspection based on either the size or service of the equipment that the owner user is operating and the level of their quality management program. That is going to actually be a pretty fun episode to do. And if you kind of want to get into it or kind of learn about it, AB 506 is the document to kind of jump into. But like that's just kind of the breadth of control that the jurisdiction has. And I don't want to say that is negative, because we operate at a pretty high standard, despite my personal opinion is our provincial regulations are actually pretty high, and we're world leaders realistically, actually.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, the 506, that's a great document, and it's think of it as if you have nothing in place. You have a facility and you don't have any type of program in place. That's what you're going to follow, and you don't have a choice. And it's laid out pretty clear in that document. Now, where you can get a little more leeway with that is if you have your own user program and you have RBI programs and things like that in there, you can stretch those intervals a little bit, but that's something you have to have in place. It's similar to like the certifying boiler external piping, same kind of thing. You can't do that unless you have it in your owner user program that you can do it. So you can bend the rules with them a little bit or stretch them a little bit as long as that's in your program and it's been approved by them. So that's just something to look out for. But yeah, if you're not familiar with that, the 506 is a great document to look at.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I don't want to kind of say we're going to breeze through this last little section, but a little bit of it is repetitive. So our on-site fabrication, you know what, same kind of thing. It may be the same contractor that fabricated it, and maybe somebody totally different. You want to make sure that their cap covers what they're supposed to be doing. You want to make sure that you're getting all the proper documentation from them, partial AB83s or final AB83s from the bolt up and stuff like that. Something that this one tickles everybody definitely for sure are the final welds / closure welds, right? We could talk forever about this stuff. I think we've already bored you for about an hour already, so I think we might roll that into a different episode. But essentially, our installation, they're going to be throwing pipe in the pipe racks. They're going to be fabricating some field run spools, especially from tankage or from mod to mod or stuff that drops down. You want to make sure that they're certified for that. You want to make sure the guys are working on it are certified for that, especially the welding. Again, your partial AB83s, I feel like I'm repeating myself now. And we're just going to lick the very good part of what's happening right now. Comes the circuitization. I'm going to jump ahead, actually, Scott. I don't give a shit. All our piping's installed. We've looked at all our documentation. It's good. We're getting systems turned over. Owner users getting happy. Plants coming together. As owner user inspectors or even contractors, hired by the owner user, we're going to get into the circuitization of piping and piping systems. Scott, do you have a lot of experience with that?
A little bit, not a lot. If you can tell, like the repair alteration is definitely my bread and butter. That's the stuff I chase around, and that's where my interest lies for sure. But yeah, that's something you want to do once the systems are in place. You want to set up your piping circuits, get your CML locations, start some of your baseline, select some of the supplemental NDE you might need to do for that, UT versus RT, those type of things. I am going to jump back a little bit, Frank, because I can't help myself here.
Yeah.
Just back to your point again, like with all the on-site stuff, you treat that the same way as you would with the new fabrication. Scrutinize them exactly the same. There's no reason you shouldn't. One thing that's interesting is when these repair contractors or construction contractors, whatever you're going to refer to them as, when they go through their audits and stuff with our regulator, they typically do it at their shop, and they go and beat up their shop pretty hard and make sure they're following everything. And for the most part, their manuals say that all the field work is controlled by the shop, so that's what they audit. But who's looking at the field work as far as the regulator's perspective? That's kind of where the owner user comes in, and they kind of rely on us a little bit as a bit of an olive branch to make sure that they're actually following their quality manual. So it's not just a matter of, they're doing their thing and the shop controls it and we'll just sign the AB83 blindly. Make sure they're following that manual, audit them, and treat them no differently than the shop. Another thing I want to touch on briefly too is the closure weld. That's another one of those regulation outranking the code type of thing.
Yeah.
Our construction code's kind of loose on that. If everything's been hydro tested, Frank talked about like welding the tie points of the two mods together. That's a great example. Yeah. So everything's been hydro tested, and you go to put this together, and it's impossible or next to impossible to hydro test. For a number of reasons, maybe process concerns, maybe just mechanical integrity with all that weight of the water in there. Whatever it is, there's a number of good reasons to not hydro test one weld per se. So the construction code's, a little too loose on that, at least as far as ABS is concerned. So they tack on a few more requirements for that. So it's essentially an in-process weld where you're watching it the whole time, making sure the welder's doing everything, following the WPS, measuring the parameters, all that good stuff. Throw a bunch of NDE at it, pretty much everything you can think of.
Yeah.
And a service test is typically a requirement too. So that's kind of like the three branches of a little bit extra that they've thrown at it, which is, what the code minimum requires plus a bunch more. And on that topic, another point I want to make is, so the AB 519 is the closure weld document. So that is an owner user program. So the owner users have a 519 program, not the repair contractors. The repair contractor works under the owner user's 519 program. So that's something that gets confused a little bit. A repair contractor cannot apply for a 519 as part of their QMS. That's an owner user thing. So you got to just watch the boundaries there. The owner user is controlling it. The repair contractor is controlling their quality manual, and both parties have certain requirements to meet. So just make sure that's being met, and the lines aren't being crossed in the wrong directions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. There's a bead of sweat dripping down Scott's forehead after saying that right now.
Passionate.
Yeah, he's been sitting with a magazine on his lap this whole time, so I can't see. That's how fired up he is about this episode.
Oh, I was looking forward to this one.
So we're essentially we're going to be moving into our baseline stuff and take advantage of stuff, especially when it's brand new, right? Like there's times when if we don't take baseline readings, they can really mess with your corrosion calculations 5 years down the road, right? Whatever, a lot of people will just take nominal. Okay. If you do have some pipe that's maybe a little bit above nominal, maybe a little bit below, you got that 12.5%.
I was just going to say, what's nominal and how much allowance do you have there?
Right. And most likely, once they figured out how to make steel pretty good and get the tolerances pretty good, why would they put extra material in the pipe when they have 12.5% leeway?
Minimum.
Most likely it's going to be on the lower end or pretty close to nominal, which is pretty nice, but just kind of take that into account because that really starts messing with your corrosion rates. And if you have baseline stuff, especially on piping that, if you have access to it, if you know that it's going to be hard to get to at some point, but it's in a service that's going to be corrosive. This is, again, during the installation kind of period. Go do a couple baseline readings on it, some suspect locations, right? You want to kind of check, is there going to be two-phase flow? Are there any impingement points? Is there a good elbow? Say you got, a mile or 1.6 kilometers of pipe rack, and then it elbows down. Well, you're definitely going to want to put some CML thickness locations on that elbow to check for erosion, stuff like that, impingement. And it might be hard to access, and they might not always want to build a scaffold to go up there to get it because it costs money. And at least you got baseline data to go from.
That's a great point with the access. What better time to get this than, have the fabrication contractor do it for you? Now,
don't talk to what we didn't start this to talk sense. All right. Just let's reel that back a little bit, but go on.
Yeah. I mean, what better time? You don't see this a lot. You're really not at all. But, there's, one or two owner user sites that they don't do this for all their piping, I would say, but a lot of it, or they push for it. They have the fabrication contractor take all the baseline readings once the spool is fabricated and mark it up on their, cut sheets or whatever they use. And there you have it. Your baseline readings, you're all set. You put your piping in place. Your baseline readings are ready to go. You populate, you create all your CMLs, you populate all your baseline data, and you're ready to go. So, I mean, it's just something to consider, especially on a big piping project. What better time? And then someone else is doing it, not you.
Yeah, and another thing to possibly look at for accessibility is process conditions. Does this section of pipe operate at a high temperature? Can I do it while it's operating? If not, you might want to take some at baseline where it's at ambient temperature to kind of just get a freaking reading, right? And put that into your quality management program.
Yeah, your
right?
IMS, whatever you have in place.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the stuff operates really hot too. So once you have your turnaround windows, don't forget about your CMLs and your piping. Piping's kind of the forgotten equipment in the the refining, upgrading industry world we live in. But it probably makes up 90% of the facilities.
Yeah. No, it's
But it doesn't always get the respect it deserves. But I think it should.
yeah. No, definitely agree with that. So on that note, I think we've done a pretty decent job of confusing everybody on kind of.
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
So, the next episode, maybe let's try and touch on circuitization and starting to implement our inspection program during startup. Depending on how excited about turnaround, I could see us maybe doing another turnaround episode though.
Yeah, for whoever really dug that episode 1, don't worry, we didn't abandon the turnarounds altogether. It's turnarounds are the best thing in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So yeah, we didn't abandon that. We just thought we'd jump right into that because that's what we do and that's what we know. And then we thought we'd maybe dabble into a little subcategories, and then we'll get back to the turnaround. So if that's kind of how we're going to progress, or at least that's what we're going to say for now.
Yeah, it is definitely coming up. Like we're recording this right now, like June 20th. So we're going into turnaround second week of July. We're going to try and do a few more episodes because we know the availability of everybody may not be there. Scott, I think you're working day shift on this DA, right?
Yeah, so that's going to make it tough with us being on opposite shifts and, having likely one day off a week or, whatever the schedule is going to be. That might make it tough, but, we'll see. If our 10 listeners all come back for this episode, maybe that'll be some motivation to do another one.
Yeah, I think out of those few downloads, my mom probably hit that twice trying to figure out how to work it. So
I think my mom was the other half of those. So.
Well, thanks again for listening. If you've made it this far, hope you're thoroughly confused. Please subscribe. Send us some feedback. Let us know how we're doing. We're still trying to work on the website. It's a madhouse out here right now. Finally, stuff's starting to open up. Scott and I are both involved in some other things on the side that do pull us away on top of our inspection jobs. So we're doing the best. But I think this is pretty cool. I think we have a lot of fun doing it, eh?
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. And don't forget to subscribe, like us, comment on Instagram. We're on all the podcast platforms. What is it? Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
Google Podcasts.
Yeah, for all you difficult
Android
users. Yes, now you don't have an excuse. You can listen to us.
Typically, engineers run Android, right? I can customize it, is what they say. I can customize it.
Well, we're looking out for you now.
Yeah. We're also on YouTube, so it's audio only. I've been trying to create some somewhat interesting graphics to kind of go along with the audio. But hey, if you're sitting at your desk and you want to hear some bullshit about pressure equipment, put us on a different tab and listen away. Don't forget, like Scott said, we're on a lot of the podcast directories. So check us out. Hope you enjoy what you're listening to, and stay safe out there. I guess we don't have a sign off. I don't know how we ended that.
We got to come out with
something cheesy and pressure equipment related, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So see you later, everybody, and I guess talk to you in a little bit.
Cue the music.